I would like to thank the organizers, the Center for Italian Studies, particularly Professor Mignone for the invitation, and to my friend Nikos Pano, who has spent quite a bit of time at Princeton. Yesterday, the panel began with a discussion of Mediterranean identity and what it consists of. The people that I work on in all of my books are, for the most part, people who would rather not speak of their identity, but in fact are forced to come up with an effective identity, by which I mean an identity which will get the job done, whether it is today achieving political asylum, or in the 17th century retrieving your cargo from, in this case, the Maltese corsairs. Okay, so this is from Anne Broghini's massive study of Malta, and my focus is on the cities of, I just realized I have to get my pointer out, the cities of Damietta, Alexandria, and it's not shown on the map, but also Rosetta, the Egyptian coast. So this map shows the contours of the time and place that I'll be talking about today. It is the Eastern Mediterranean in the 17th and 18th centuries, when Catholic corsairs, or pirates, depending upon your point of view, swarmed into the Eastern Mediterranean. And this map shows the places of the Maltese corso, Maltese attacks on Ottoman shipping, starting from Malta and going into the Eastern Mediterranean. As you can see, they're all over the place. These are the principal places, so the Egyptian coastline was a major venue. So it's in this period when Catholic corsairs or pirates swarmed into the Eastern Mediterranean, and the most formidable of these were the Knights of St. John on Malta, both the knights themselves and those who paid to fly their flag. This was the distinction between the public and the private corso. Now, Catholic corsairs may need a bit of an introduction, first because when we think of the global age of piracy, as the 17th century is often called, it is most common to think of the Indian Ocean and especially the Atlantic world. When the Mediterranean is included, the focus is usually on North African corsairs, the group known often as the Barbary corsairs. Catholic corsairing takes off after 1570, the Ottoman defeat at Lepanto in today's mainland Greece, after which point the Ottomans no longer regularly patrolled the Eastern Mediterranean. At that point, in the words of a recent and exhaustive study of Malta in this period, from where I get this map, quote, Malta became a veritable corsair state and was without a doubt the benchmark for Christian corsairing, just as Algiers and Tunis symbolized Barbary corsairing, end quote. The patents or permissions or licenses which made a corsairing venture legal, at least in the eyes of the Maltese authorities, and kind of sort of depending on what day of the week it was and who was attacked, generally in Europe, these patents authorized raids, quote, a danno di infideli, that is, raids to damage the infidels. The booming corsairing economy attracted many to the island, whereas the population barely budged during the 16th century. Between 1590 and 1670, the number of people on Malta doubled from 30,000 in 1590 to 60,000 in 1670. The map here shows that Alexandria and Damietta, that is the Egyptian coast, they were one of the principal areas of corsairing attacks, and in my talk today, I'm focusing on this Egyptian arena. And my focus in my work, and I'm drawing on my 2010 book for this course, for this talk, my focus is on the victims. It's not so much a study of Maltese piracy, but how the victims tried to cope with it. The Egyptian coast was very attractive because Ottoman ships routinely left the ports of Egypt, Rosetta, Damietta, and Alexandria, laden down with rice for the Ottoman cities of the northern Aegean, Istanbul and Thessaloniki in particular. So we're talking about this route. They were laden down with rice for Thessaloniki and especially Istanbul, where the palace's appetite for rice was boundless. Rice was a valuable commodity, and as a stolen cargo, it was easy to dispose of, to sell. Let me take a minute to describe to you the world of Ottoman commerce in the Eastern Mediterranean in the 17th century, and what the eruption of Catholic piracy meant for those who were plying the waters between Egypt and Istanbul. So often, I think the Mediterranean is viewed from west to east. This was certainly the vantage point of Ferdinand Braudel, whose gaze began in places like Genoa and Marseille, looking east. The same perspective is in evidence in other well-known aspects of Mediterranean history, be it the Crusades or the arrival of northern ships, the Dutch, the English, in the inland sea towards the end of the 16th century. As someone who works on the Greek world, my perspective begins in the east and looks west. In 1517, Selim II wrested Egypt away from the Mamluks, and for the first time in nearly 1,000 years, the northern and southern shores of the Eastern Mediterranean were once again under one sovereign. Grain shipments to Istanbul, interrupted as it were by the Muslim conquest of Egypt in the 7th century, resumed, and rice followed soon afterwards. Over the course of the 16th century, the Ottomans took a string of islands which had remained under Latin domination, most notably Rhodes and Cyprus. And for most of the 16th century, the Eastern Mediterranean was a relatively peaceful Ottoman lake, the watery heart of the empire, one could say. The Ottomans protected the precious cargoes of grain and rice with an official convoy. Things had changed somewhat by the 17th century. The Ottoman state, buffeted by one financial crisis after the next, no longer took charge of this vital commerce. But that does not mean that there was a decline in commerce, as is often assumed. Instead, the trade was taken over by merchants who migrated from the Dodecanese Islands. Let me see, where's Rhodes? Up here. Anyway, in the southeastern Aegean. It was taken over by merchants who migrated from the Dodecanese Islands and the coast of southwest Anatolia to set up shop in Rosetta, Damietta, and Alexandria, and to handle shipments of rice to Thessaloniki and Istanbul. Greeks and Turks, in other words, in today's parlance. For some reason, this has not been investigated, Egyptian Arabs did not participate in this trade. And this world is relatively unknown, quite extraordinary, but some of the wealth of this world is, you can still see in today's Rosetta, where the mansions that these merchants built still stand. And they have names like Tokatlı, Amasyala, cities in Anatolia, showing that they had their origins there. This migration from the Dodecanese and southwest Anatolia is almost entirely unknown in Mediterranean history, overshadowed as it has been by international migration to Alexandria in the 19th century. This is an earlier wave of migration to the Egyptian coast. It's also the case that Ottoman maritime history has, in my opinion, been too closely identified with the history of the Ottoman Navy and the central state, and once it is no longer effective, it is as if the Ottoman Mediterranean does not need to be investigated. Anyway, it was this trade and these merchants and sea captains, both Muslim and Christian, who became the targets of Maltese piracy in the 17th century. Their attacks were not attacks on the high seas. Instead, the knights themselves and those who paid to fly their flag sailed deep into Ottoman waters and shattered what had been a relatively self-contained world. The Greek response to these attacks was the subject of the book that I wrote several years ago. Now, why did I focus on the Greek response? I won't go into all of the reasons, but one of the reasons why the Greeks are such a productive subject of inquiry is that, unlike Muslims and Jews who were attacked, the Greeks could and did pursue legal recourse at the prize court in Malta, the institution known as the Tribunale degli Armamenti. I should note that I'm calling the court that. Prize court history is focused almost exclusively on the Atlantic world, and in fact there has not been a study of this institution in Malta. At any rate, the Greeks went to Malta. If a Muslim or a Jew showed up in Malta, they would be immediately enslaved. The Greeks, as Christians, were in a different position. So their recourse to the to the court has produced a fascinating documentary trail. What were the Greeks after? Very simply, the recovery of their goods, and even sometimes their ships, or if that was not possible, at least compensation for what they had lost. The Tribunale, I think it is fair to say, could not turn the Greeks away, but it was there to block these attempts, not least because the magistrates who heard the Greek cases, in all cases actually, were actually paid through a share in the booty that had been taken during these expeditions to the Eastern Mediterranean, a danno de infideli. The question may well arise, why were the Maltese attacking Christians? After all, Christians were not infidels. Suffice it to say here that the Maltese had all sorts of ways of suggesting that the Greeks, although Christians, were legitimate targets. For instance, they might say that the ship was secretly owned by a Muslim. Like any prize court, the Tribunale had rules of what was considered legal prize, buona preda. And as you might have suspected by now, these rules turned on the religion of the victim or of the cargo or of the ship. Thus, statute number 15 from the Statute of the Tribunale, which was established in 1605, states that before a license would be granted to the armatori, those who had invested their money in arming a vessel for the corso, they had to pledge that they would not cause harm to Christians themselves, their goods, or their merchant vessels. Nor would they attack infidels who could show authentic safe conducts issued by either the Grand Master of the order or other Christian princes. They also had to swear that they would not injure any Christian vessel carrying goods belonging to Christians. Now, the record shows, unsurprisingly, that these rules were observed more in the breach. But they were significant nevertheless, and this is the point I want to focus on today. As I mentioned earlier, in carrying out their attacks, the knights were sailing deep into Ottoman waters. Yet the rules of the Tribunale, combined with the Greek response, served to elevate and instantiate the claims of Christian sovereignty over the waters of the Eastern Mediterranean, thus transforming what had been an Ottoman lake into something rather different. It was also a place where locals found that they had to prove their identity to European standards or become objects of suspicion, and this attitude endured. Let me read a quote from the late 18th century during the Napoleonic Wars. This is a recent book, so this is a British academic writing in the 1990s about the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean in the late 18th century. He writes, "What indeed was an Ottoman ship? Few local mariners knew any rules of the sea. Their papers were often incomprehensible. Their crews resisted investigation with spirit." Okay? And the origins of this attitude, whereby locals become objects of suspicion, I suggest, happened in the 17th century. So the Greek response was both rhetorical and procedural. First, let me make clear what they did not do. Greek merchants and captains did not go to Malta as aggrieved Ottoman subjects. There were no diplomatic relations between the knights and the Ottoman sultans, and their status as Ottoman subjects was in fact a key aspect of their vulnerability vis-a-vis the knights. It is clear that the Greek petitioners understood the rules of the game. The very fact that they presented themselves in front of the Tribunale indicates that they knew that they had some standing, and they knew that the way to go was to assert their Christianity. On the rhetorical level, they did this in a multitude of ways, some obvious, some less so, or at least less obvious to the 21st century reader. For example, in 1634, two Greek merchants who showed up at the Tribunale brought with them a letter from the Archbishop of Carpathos, which I just noticed here does happen to be on the map, so from here, in the southern Aegean. This was not usual. They were attacked in Carpathos, and thus they must have decided to take advantage of the Archbishop's presence there. The Archbishop wrote in part, and they carried this letter with them to Malta. "The wretched merchants came to me and asked me for a letter and for witness from me. Thus I write and I witness with the fear of God in mind and with the faith of Orthodox Christianity that the truth is that the ship and the cargo are Christian, and everyone on board is Christian. And there are never any Turks, and the wretched merchants come crying to you and begging for justice as a just sovereign. And we ask that you not deal unjustly with and rob Christians, which would be a great shame and an injustice." End quote. In my opinion, the need to prove somehow the 100% Christian character of the trade being attacked also explains why the plaintiffs often went into great detail over matters that would seem unimportant on the face of it. Testifying on behalf of a victimized merchant named Giovanni in 1683, Another merchant responded to the tribunale's questions as to whether the merchant had bought the goods with his own money. Yes, the merchant said. He explained that the two of them lived together in the same Han in Rosetta, that they ate together every day, and that as members of the same nation, they did business together. Many times, Giovanni had counted his money in his presence. On the procedural level, the Greeks, in all cases, turned to French consuls in places like Saida, Izmir/Smyrna, Cairo, and they turned to them for depositions, where they laid out what had happened, and for laissez-passers. And let me give you a few quotes of the sorts of things, the kinds of documents that the French produced for the Greek petitioners. July 1632, the two litigants turned to the French vice consul on Chios, and they got this document from him. The consul wrote, to all whom it concerns, these two Christians of the Greek rite are leaving Smyrna to go and recover, with God's help, some goods. The goods they intend to recover belong to them, as attested by documents in Chios. Another case from the 1630s. Haji Petro brought with him a document signed by the French consul in Cairo, Gabriele Fernosi. The consul certified and attested to the fact that at the request of Haji Petro, the Patriarch of Alexandria had given the following sworn testimony. He then writes that the testimony was given because this said patron Pietro intends to depart and to go to Christendom in order to recover his ship and the rice carried in it. The consul finishes by requesting and urging all the rulers and governors of the places in Christendom where the ship may go to look with Christian charity and piety upon the just cause of Patron Pietro, given that he is a Christian and that the merchandise on board was Christian. So it's a kind of certificate of Christianity. It's interesting to think about this for a minute. The French consuls in the Ottoman Empire had two jobs, official jobs. First, the French consul was there to represent his country before the Ottomans, and then he also had authority over the French échelle or nation in the various ports. And yet here we see him performing a very different function, giving paperwork to Ottoman subjects to take to a third party, to take to the Knights of St. John on Malta. And what I argue here is that you see an understanding on the part of the Greeks, an acceptance on the part of the French consuls that to cross the Mediterranean you now need a certificate of Christianity. In the few minutes remaining to me, I'd like to step away from the attacks along the Egyptian coast and look at another aspect of the Mediterranean world in the 17th century, and that is the Counter-Reformation or the Catholic Reformation. In Greek historiography, where the Counter-Reformation looms large, it has been seen, the Counter-Reformation has been seen as part of cultural, religious, and intellectual history of the Greek people. In fact, it intersects as well with commerce, piracy, and the larger issue of mobility in the Eastern Mediterranean for Ottoman subjects that I've been discussing. And why is this? This is for two reasons. First, because Rome linked the two, and secondly, because the victims of the Maltese attacks, knowing of Rome's interest in them, went to Rome for help. So let me give you an example of how these two are linked, both by the victims and by people in Rome itself. This is a statement by the Propaganda Fide in 1627, and the cardinals of the Propaganda Fide, as they continue their attempts to depose the Patriarch in Istanbul, Lucaris, whom they were afraid was going to bring the Greek world in on the side of Protestantism. I won't go into that, but this is... And they came up with an 8-point declaration. This is numbers, most of them are having to do with theology, but this is point number 7. The Greek merchants, those who trade in Christian cities, should be warned that they should work toward casting out Cyril, Patriarch of the heretics, from the Patriarchal See, and that they should take care that another who abhors the Western heresies be substituted. Otherwise, their ships and goods will be destroyed by Christian soldiers. Until now, they were safe, but they will become their prize. We see this in correspondence between the papal authorities and the inquisitor in Malta. The inquisitor, Francesco Barberini, writes in 1635 to Chigi, the inquisitor in Malta, that a certain knight has taken goods from 3 Greek merchants named Luca, Constantino, and Nicolo from Thessaloniki. And Barberini tells Chigi that he should ensure the return of their goods, since the new patriarch seemed to hold the Catholic Church in great esteem. Okay, Lucaris has now been deposed. If we return these goods, he continued, the patriarch will be pleased with them and not with the English and Dutch heretics. So thus we see the rather extraordinary coincidence, and it is a coincidence, that just as religiously defined Catholic corsairing spikes in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Counter-Reformation in Rome becomes interested in bringing Eastern Christians back into the fold of the Church as they see it. The Church links these two things, and the petitioners themselves are well aware of Rome's interest in them and use that interest to try and obtain justice for the things they're suffering in the Eastern Mediterranean. At the same time, be careful what you wish for, because what the Vatican also has to contend with is the difficulty of figuring out who these people are that are coming from the Eastern Mediterranean. So you have a string of petitioners. Bernard Haberger's work on Arab Christians in the 17th and 18th century has shown that the vast majority of claims to the Vatican by people claiming to be Catholic have to do with commerce. These people show up and say, I've converted, you should help me. And then somebody else comes 2 months later and says, you know, that person who showed up, they didn't really convert, it's a fake conversion, and you should help me instead. To my mind, the similarities with today are quite remarkable. There is a Western intrusion into the Eastern Mediterranean, which creates a stream of, today, refugees or migrants, in this case, petitioners to Rome. And even today, we have in Europe a small number of the migrants converting to Christianity. And then the West struggles to find a satisfactory way of establishing identity to deal with the people that approach them. Thank you very much.